Today you'll learn how to build your own custom messaging app like WhatsApp without writing a single line of code using a tool called Bubble. Before we start this process, let's have a quick look at what we're going to be building today. Over in my application, because I already have an account, I can just log in through my existing login page here. And so I'm just going to jump ahead and add in my details here. Then I can head on down and click the login button, and that's just going to redirect me through to my WhatsApp homepage. Then over on my homepage, you'll see a list of all of my existing chats that I have. And these of course include chats with single users or group chats that I'm a part of. On the homepage, you'll also see that I have the ability to filter through chats just by typing in the name of the person I would like to pull up the chat with. And if that user is in any existing chats that I'm also a part of, it's just going to filter those down and display those in my homepage list. On the homepage, I can also choose to open up my contacts book here. And now it's going to display a list of all of the users that I have in my contact list. If I would like, I could choose to add a new contact to my list. And I can do this by searching for someone's phone number. Then of course, once I choose to save this person to my contact list, it's going to add them to this list on my page. And now if I was to click on the name of anyone in this list, it will either create a new chat with them or open our existing chat. And also from this pop-up, I'll have the ability to create a new group chat. And so if I was to click on the new group button, it's going to allow me to select who I want to add into this particular group chat, from which I can then go ahead and create this. What I also just want to show you on my homepage is that you'll see I have some unread message notifications on the right-hand side, and that just displays a list of the total count of messages I've received since I've opened that chat. And so in this case, I'm going to choose to open my chat here with Jackson Smith. It's then going to redirect me through to my dedicated chat page here. And within this chat, I can scroll on through all of our messages. And as you'll see, my messages will be displayed on the right-hand side in green, whereas all of the opposing person's messages will be displayed on the left-hand side. And of course, within this chat, we can also send both text-based messages as well as image-based messages. And so I'm just going to jump ahead and add a response to this message here. I'll send this, and what you'll see is that it's automatically displayed within my page here. And of course, it also has a timestamp on it, so that way I can see when that message was actually created. And look, this is just scratching the surface of what I'm going to cover within our tutorial today. But as you can see, we have a fully functional WhatsApp clone. If you ever wanted to build your own app or startup, you'll know firsthand how complicated it can be bringing your vision to life. Using a tool called Bubble though, it simplifies the whole process by removing the complexity of you having to manually write the code. Bubble's what's referred to as a no-code tool, which in simple terms just means it allows you to visually create your own app without having to touch a single line of code. Now, if you're a non-technical person like this guy, Bubble's going to quickly become your new best friend. The tool allows you to create your own custom database, build out the user interface of your app, make everything functional using what's called workflows, and also integrate with third-party tools and services. Now, each one of these features would be considered their own no-code tool, whereas Bubble actually gives you the ability to do all of this in one single platform. Damn! I've said it before and I'll say it again, Bubble truly is just the avatar of no-code tools. It's mastered all of the nations you need, and it's going to remove a ton of complexity out of your life. Look, there's so much that I want to cover within our build today, so let's grab our Bubble editor and we can dive right into it. Within our build today, the first thing I want to walk us through isn't actually going to be creating a core feature that users are going to engage with within our WhatsApp clone. Instead, I just wanted to take the time to set up and configure the necessary data types and fields that are going to allow us to power the rest of our application. And if you're relatively new to Bubble, you might find the whole process of building out a custom database to be a little bit overwhelming, and that's completely okay. I remember when I first started, it was the exact same. It took me a lot of practice to get comfortable creating my own custom databases for every single app idea that I had. And thankfully, I'm here today to make the whole process as easy as possible for yourself. And in fact, I have everything structured out within this doc here that we're going to be adding into our Bubble editor. And this is just a personal preference I have when I create any Bubble application. I'm also a big fan of Notion's tool, which just allows you to create a checklist of all of the items you'd like to not only add into your database, but also a list of all of the features we're going to be including within our build today. And what I love about Notion is that it just allows you to check off items as you add them into your editor. So that way you can easily keep track of where you are throughout the whole building process. And of course, I'll be sure to share a link to this Notion doc within this particular tutorial. So that way you can create a duplicate and follow along throughout the process. Now at the top of my Notion checklist here, you may see that I have a series of what's referred to as data types and fields. And the best way to explain everything is by actually just opening up a brand new Bubble editor. So I've created a new app from scratch here, and as you can see, there's currently nothing on my page. However, what I'd like to do is just jump over to my data tab below my little screen recorder. And the first thing you'll see is that we have a tab here called data types. Now, when you're creating a custom database, data types are the overarching entities which will determine what information you store in your application. And so a great example is that you'll see there's already an existing user data type here, which is added by default from Bubble. And the reason why you have a user data type as standard is because whenever someone registers an account within your application, you're going to be creating a new user. And so in this instance, you'll be adding a new entry into your user data type. However, when it comes to each individual user within your app, you might like to store some information about things like their name, their profile photo, or even a short bio. And all of that is information that will sit within each individual user's account. And that information is referred to as your data fields, which are all of these fields you see on the right-hand side here. And what you'll also notice is that by default, Bubble has already included an email data field, which just allows users to store an email when they register an account. There is also a password field, but you won't be able to see this for privacy reasons, but it is there. And so when it comes to creating your own custom database, the first thing you'll need to do is just identify all of the data types and data fields you'd like to include within your build. And when I'm creating my own databases, the way I think of this process is by first writing down a list of all of the things that users will need to create. And in most cases, they will be our data types. So back in my Notion doc here, you'll see that I have a user data type because of course our users will create a new user account. So that is an overarching thing that they will create. I also have what's known as a chat data type. So whenever someone wants to talk to another user within our WhatsApp clone today, they're going to create a new chat between those two users. And then finally, I'm also going to allow users to create new messages, which will be stored within each chat. And so because users can create and send messages, of course, that is also going to be a data type. And so before I build out all of the data fields, what I'd like to do is add in all of my 3 data types here. So I'm going to jump over into Bubble and I'm going to add a new data type called chat and then another data type called message. And now one thing I should also just point out before we add in all of our relevant data fields is that you may notice next to your user data type, you have this text here that just indicates that there are in fact some privacy rules applied to this user data type. And if we were to click on this, it's going to take us through to our privacy tab here. And what you'll see is a default privacy setting that Bubble has added. And this setting just ensures that users are only able to see the information that they create in the database, not any information that other users create. And while that can be helpful for some applications, that's actually not the experience we want to create today. In fact, what we want is for users to be able to create and exchange messages between each other, which means that if you and I were having a conversation within our WhatsApp clone, and you were to create a message within our chat, I, the receiver of that message, would also need to be able to view that. And so in this case, this privacy rule is not going to be helpful for the experience we want to create. And so what I'm going to do is select the little trash can icon here and choose to delete that. And what you'll now see is that our user data type is now publicly visible, which is the exact experience we want to create. If you find that for some reason you're previewing your application after I've shown you how to actually send messages and you see that messages aren't being displayed, 9 times out of 10, it's probably because you've forgotten to delete this privacy rule here. I've definitely been burned by that in the past as well. So I definitely recommend just double checking that you do in fact remove this privacy setting whenever you create a similar application. But from here, I'm just going to veer back into my data types tab because now what I'd like to do is add all of the relevant data fields that sit within each data type. So as I mentioned, data fields are the actual information you'd like to store for each entry that's created in your database. So for every user account that is created, I'd like to store their name, their phone number, a profile photo, some text, which is like a bio, as well as a list of all their contacts. And so what we're going to do is jump over into our bubble editor. We'll open up our user data type here, and we'll choose to create a brand new data field. And we'll just call this the name. So this is going to store someone's actual name. And when it comes to data fields, you'll also just need to choose the format in which you'll be storing data for this particular value. And in this case, I'd like a user's name to just be a plain text field. I'll choose to create that. Then I'm going to create another field here, and this is going to be called phone number. And now just a personal preference of mine is that when I'm creating a data field with 2 words, I like to just include a dash instead of a space. And the reason I do that is because later on when we need to reference our data fields, I'll easily be able to tell these apart from the actual data types, because our data types won't use dashes between 2 words. And so if I use a dash between my data fields, I can easily differentiate between what is a data type and what is a data field. And now when it comes to this particular field, contrary to what you might think, this is actually just going to be a text field, not a number. You'll only need to use a number when you want to perform actual calculations. But if you're just displaying a string of numbers for the sake of displaying someone's phone number, this is just going to be a text field type. I'll choose to create this. Then I'd like to create another field which is going to store a profile photo for a user. And in this case, this is going to be an image field type, because of course I'd like someone to be able to upload a custom image to their profile. And now one thing I would just like to point out is that within our application today, if a user has not taken the time to upload a custom profile photo, I'd still like to actually display a default icon, which is just going to be a generic user profile photo. And so what you'll see on the far right hand option here is to add a default value next to any data field. So that just essentially means that every single time a user creates their own account, the field itself will have a default value stored until a user chooses to update that. And in this case, I'm just going to upload a default profile photo I have, which is just a standard and generic profile image. And as you'll see, this is just a generic image of a blank user. If you'd also like to upload a similar image, I'd recommend just Google searching generic user image, and you'll find a similar image yourself. And of course, later on, if a user was to upload their own custom profile photo, it would replace this image with the custom image that they have uploaded. Then from here, what I'm going to do is create another field, and I'm going to call this the About field. So you can kind of think of this like a bio for a user. And in this instance, the field type is just going to be a text field. I'll create that. And then finally, the very last field I'd like to store under a user's account is going to be a list of all of their contacts. So every single time someone would like to message someone, they'll be able to add them to their contacts and then send them a message. And so when it comes to this field, I'm going to call this contacts. And in this instance, what I'd like to do is store a list of users within this field. And so what I can actually do is open up our field type here. And if I was to scroll on down to the bottom, you'll see that we can actually reference our existing data types. And this is where you'll start to see the power of Bubble's no-code database come to life. Essentially, it allows you to create a truly relational database, which in simple terms just means that you can reference all of your different data types. So for instance, if a user needed to store a list of contacts, I can have this be a list of users from our application. So I'm going to select the user data type here, and I'm going to tick that this should be a list of multiple entries. And so within this list of users, whenever a person adds someone into their contact list, it's going to store them within that total list of users here. I'll choose to create this. And of course, I know that might sound a little bit confusing, but I'll be sure to explain that in more detail when we actually create the feature to add contacts. But for now, that's actually everything we'll need to include within our user data type. What we can do is just jump back into our Notion checklist here. I'm going to highlight all of these data fields and choose to check those off. And now we can move down to our list of data fields that are going to be added within our chat data type. So within every single chat that is created in our database, I'd like to store a list of users within that. So going back to my example before, if you and I were wanting to talk within our WhatsApp clone today, I would need to store a list of users within that specific chat. And that list of users would contain both yourself and I. And the same concept will also apply when we build out our group chat feature later on. Essentially, in that use case, you just add a larger list of users. And so what we're going to do is just jump over into our bubble editor once again. I'm going to open up my chat data type here. I'm going to create a field and I'm going to call this chat-users. And once again, because I'm going to be storing a list of users for this data field, I'm going to set the field type as a user, and I'll tick that that should be a list with multiple entries. I'll choose to create that. Then what I'd also like to do is create a field which just identifies the timestamp in which the very last message was sent within this chat. So that way, when a user views their homepage and they can see a list of all of their current chats, they'll easily be able to see what time the last message was sent. And so I'm going to create a field here and I'm going to call this last message date. And when it comes to this field type, I'm going to select that this should be a date, which will allow me to set a timestamp on this field later on. And while we're working with fields that store the value of dates, I'd also just like to create a field that's just going to recognize what particular timestamp a user viewed a message within a chat. So let's say, back to my example, you and I are chatting within our WhatsApp clone and you send me a message. If I was to then open up that particular chat, what I'd like to do is update the timestamp in which I had opened that chat. And this information is actually going to be quite helpful later on when we want to create an unread message notification experience, because we'll be able to determine at what point in time I had opened that chat. And if you've sent any additional messages since I have last opened that chat, I should receive a notification saying that you've done so. And so I'm going to create a field here, and I'm going to call this last viewed by user, and I'm going to set this field type to be a date once again, so that way I can set a timestamp on this field. I'll choose to create that. And then from here, I'd like to add a series of additional data fields into my chat data type, which is just going to cater to our group chat experience we're going to build out later on. So we're going to need to create a way to identify if a chat is just a chat between two users or if it's actually a group chat between many users. And so what I can do is choose to create a field here. And I'm going to call this isGroupChat. And for this field type, I can set this to be a yes/no value, which means that it either is a group chat or it is not a group chat. I'll choose to create this. And with this field, I'm going to take the time to just set a default value here to be no. So that way, by default, a chat will not be a group chat. It's only going to be a group chat when a user adds more than one additional person to this chat. And that, of course, is something we're going to build out later on throughout our tutorial today. And then if a chat is in fact going to be a group chat, what I'd like to do is store both a name and an image for this group chat. So that way users can customize the actual title and the profile photo that's displayed whenever they see this chat on their homepage. And so I'm going to create a field here called group chat title. And this field type is going to be a text field type. And then I'll also create another field called group chat image. And as you probably guessed, this field type is going to be an image. I'll choose to create this. And now that's everything we'll need to add within our chat data type here. So if we jump back into our Notion checklist, I'm going to tick off that we've finished adding in all of those data fields. And now you'll see that we're at our very last data type, which is just going to be our message data type. So whenever a user creates a new message, the first thing I'm going to want to do is, of course, not only store the contents of that message, so that's the text itself within that message, but I'd like to link this message to a chat between two users. So that way, if I was to open up my chat between yourself and I within my application, I could tell Bubble to load all of the messages that have been exchanged within that chat. And so if I open up my Bubble editor here, I'm going to select my message data type. And then the first thing I'm going to do is create a new field called chat. And so this is going to be the original chat that each individual message should belong to. And so for this field type here, I'm going to set this to be a chat. And this is going to link to our chat data type. And whenever someone creates a message within a dedicated chat, I'll be explaining later on how we can actually link that inside of that chat. So that way it only displays between the two relevant users. And then from here though, I'd like to create another data field, and I'm going to call this message content. So this field type is just going to be the actual substance of the message itself. So this is where we'll be storing the text that's typed and sent within a message. And so for this field type, it's going to be a text value. I'll choose to create this. And then finally, later on within our build, I'm also going to explain how users can send image messages. So I'm also going to need to create a field called image. And I'm going to set this field type to be, as you probably guessed, an image. So that way users will be able to upload and send images within their particular chat. I'll choose to create that. And then that's actually everything we'll need to add within our message data type. This one was relatively straightforward. And that's actually everything we'll need to add within our overall database. So I'm going to jump back into Notion and check those off. And as you can see, it's never been easier to create your own completely custom database without writing a single line of code using Bubble's tool. Now that we've finished taking the time to structure our database, I want to move along to the list of features that I have set out for us today. And as you can see, the very first feature I want to cover is just being able to create a page that allows us to register new user accounts. So of course, before someone can actually engage with our WhatsApp platform, the first thing we'll need to do is build out a page that will allow them to sign up. And thankfully, this is a relatively straightforward process. And so we're just going to jump over into our Bubble editor here. And within our editor, we're going to actually create a brand new page where we're going to house this whole experience. So we're going to open up our page drop-down menu in the top left-hand corner here. And I'll select to add a new page. I'll call this the register page, and I'll choose to create this. Then over on our registration page, the very first thing we're going to do is open up my property editor here. And I'm going to update the background color of this just to be a light shade of gray. And the reason I do this is that because when I'm working inside of Bubble, it just allows me to see where the borders of my page sit within my overall editor. And of course, before I take a preview of my app, or if I was to publish my app, I could always just revert this to be a flat color of white. But for the time being, I'm just going to leave this as a shade of gray. I'll also then just need to jump over into my layout tab, because I'll need to define the container layout for our page. Now, if you're relatively new to Bubble, you might not be too familiar with what a container layout is. Essentially, a container layout just determines in which way elements will be placed on your page. And so if I was to open up this drop down here, you'll see that we can select from 4 different options. Now, I personally prefer to only select from 2 of these 4 options, and that'll either be a row or a column. And now the difference between the two is that if you were to set the container layout of your page to be a row, it would essentially stack elements on your page side by side, so horizontally. And perhaps the best way to illustrate this is just by showing you an example. If I was to set the container layout on my page to be a row, and then if I was to just add in 2 button elements onto my page, you'll see that these are positioned side by side. So they're positioned across our page horizontally. However, if I was to click back on my page and open up the layout tab, the other option I could potentially choose from is the column option. And what this will essentially do is allow me to position my elements vertically. And so now, as you'll see, these 2 elements are stacked on top of each other. And now when it comes to the overall container layout of our page, in 99% of use cases, I'll select the column option. Because when you think of the structure of an overall page for any app or website, everything is positioned on that page from top to bottom. And although you might have some elements that sit horizontally across your page, the overall page structure should be positioned vertically. So we'll select from this column option. And later on within our tutorial today, I'll be explaining how we can even position elements side by side when the overall page layout is a column. But if you're to take away anything from this tutorial at this point, it's that when you're setting the container layout of a page, I'd personally recommend choosing the column option. As I mentioned, I'll almost never select the align to parent or fixed option. And so we're just going to select the column choice. I'll also just quickly delete these elements off my page. And now if I was to just show you a quick example of what we're going to be building within our editor, I just have an existing version here. Essentially, we're just going to create a page that's the size of a mobile screen. And on that page, we're going to have a series of input fields that are going to allow someone to store some information that they'll, of course, link to their account. And thankfully, all of this is relatively straightforward to build. And of course, I'll be sure to explain everything you need to know in as much detail as possible. But if we jump back into our main bubble editor here, we're going to open up our layout tab one more time, and I'm going to update the preset page width of this page to be a mobile device size. And what that's going to do is just set the width of our UI builder here. So the UI builder just refers to us building our user interface within our editor. It's going to set that to be 380 pixels in width. However, of course, this is just the width of our UI builder within our overall editor. If I was to open up my responsive tab here and drag out the preview of my page on, let's say, a device like a desktop, what you'll see is that this page is going to be fully responsive. So it will in fact be able to be displayed across both mobile and desktop devices. And then back in our UI builder, we can start to create the page itself. And you might remember that at the top of my page, I had the green header, which displayed the WhatsApp logo followed by the name WhatsApp itself. And now in order to create that experience, the first thing I'm going to do is just add a section on my page that will be displayed as that green color. And the way I'll be doing this is by heading to my containers menu, and I'm going to add a group element onto my page. Now, if you're not familiar with groups, they essentially just allow you to store a series of elements inside of them. So if I was to show you my example over in my separate editor here, you'll see that within my overall green group here, I have two elements. There's an image and then there's some text. And if I was to move this group somewhere on my page, what you'll see is that all of the elements that sit inside of it are going to move with it. And so what we're going to do is just jump back into our main bubble editor here. And before I do anything on this group, I'm just going to update the appearance of this, just so I can actually see where it sits on my page. So when it comes to the style of this group, I'm just going to remove the style here, and I'm going to set the background style to be a flat color, and then I'm just going to paste in this green color code that I have. If you'd like this, it's 25D366, and it's just a similar green color code to the WhatsApp branding. I'm also then just going to jump over to my layout tab, because one thing I should point out is that we're also going to need to set the container layout of our group here. So because a group can store elements inside of it, you can kind of think of it like a little mini page inside your overall page. And because we're going to be stacking elements inside of this group, we're going to need to update its container layout. And of course, if you looked at my example before, you would have seen that there's an image that sits above a text element, which means we're going to be stacking elements vertically once again. So for the container layout of this group, I'm going to set this to be a column here. And now you'll see that we have all of these options to customize the width and height of this element. And this is where we can actually take the time to make our page fully responsive across any device size. So at this point in time, this group is set to be a fixed width of 400 pixels, which just means that regardless of how small or how large the page is, this will always remain 400 pixels in width. But what I'd like to do is create an experience that makes this group responsive across any device size. So if I was to open up my responsive editor here, what you'll see is that as I expand the width of my page out, because this group won't scale past 400 pixels, it's going to remain static on my page there. Whereas if I was to instead unselect that this group should be a fixed width, what you'll see is that this group now has what's referred to as an infinite maximum width, which just means that it's going to infinitely scale out and take up as much space as it can on our page. And then if I was to set the minimum width of this group to be 0, that essentially means that it could contract down to 0 pixels in width. So now, regardless of how wide or how small my page becomes, this element is going to be indefinitely responsive. And now you'll see me reference these settings at multiple points throughout our tutorial today, because essentially, in my opinion, whenever you want to create a fully responsive experience within Bubble, you'll need to set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. And now when it comes to the height, we'll come back in a moment and update that setting. But first we'll just need to add in all of our elements we'd like to stack within this group. So if I just jump back to my UI builder here, I'm going to start by adding an image element into my group. And for this image, I just have a white WhatsApp logo saved on my local device. So I'm just going to upload this as a static image. And once I've uploaded this image, I'm going to jump over into my layout tab because I'd like to update the size of this image itself. Now, when it comes to this image, I'm going to set the width to be 100 pixels. And I will in fact keep this as a fixed width because I don't want this image to scale up or down based on the width of a user's browser. I'm always going to want this to be 100 pixels in width, no bigger and no smaller. I'm also going to tick this option to keep this element's aspect ratio fixed. And if I set the ratio as 1:1, which is the default option, it's going to make this image 100 pixels by 100 pixels, which makes it a perfect square. I'm then going to update the horizontal alignment of this image on my overall group to be centered. So that way it's now going to sit in the center of this group regardless of where it is on my page. And then finally, when it comes to the margins, I just like to add in 30 pixels of margin at the top. So that way this image element doesn't touch the border of my green group. Now below this, what I'd like to do is add in a text element that's just going to display the word WhatsApp. So I'm going to head to my visual elements here. I'll add a text element into my green group. And I'll have this, as I mentioned, display the word WhatsApp. I'm then going to choose to remove the style of this text here, just because I'd like to customize the text to be 30 pixels in font size. I'd also like to center this text in the middle of my actual text element. I'd like to bold this text and then finally set the color of this to be white. And then from here, I'm going to jump over to my layout tab because I'd like to update the position of this text element in my green group. And now when it comes to this text element, the easiest way to position this in the center indefinitely, whilst also making this element responsive, is to once again unselect that this element should be a fixed width. I'll leave the maximum width as infinite and set the minimum width here to be 0. And what that'll do is just ensure that regardless of my page size, this element is going to be completely responsive here. I'll also just take the time to update the height of this particular text element. I'm going to set this to be 0, just because we have this option selected by default, which fits the height of this element to the content within it, which just means that this text element is going to wrap around the text that sits inside of it nicely. And then finally from here, I just like to add in 30 pixels of margin at the bottom of this text element. And the reason I'm doing that is because once I've finished adding all of my elements into my green group here, I'm going to select on my green group, I'm going to head on down to the height settings, and because we once again have this option selected to fit the height of this element to the content within it, what I'm going to do is set the minimum height of this group to be 0, and it's now going to collapse around my elements nicely. And because there's 30 pixels of margin at the bottom of this text element, it's just going to ensure there's some space between the text and the border of my group. And now that's everything I'll need to add within my green group here. The next thing I'll need to do is start adding in all of my input fields where a user can register the information that will be stored within their account. But before I do that, I'm just going to add in one text heading at the top of my page. So I'm going to once again grab a text element, and I'm going to add this in the gray section, which is my overall page, not within my green group. And because our container layout of our page is set to be a column, it's going to stack vertically below our green group. And then for this text element, I'm going to have this just display the words, create a new account. I'm then going to remove the style of this because I'd like to update the size of this font to be 20. I will center align this. I will bold this. And then I'm going to jump over to my layout tab because I'd like to make this element completely responsive. So once again, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. I'll also set the minimum height as 0, making sure we have this option selected to fit the height of this element to the content within it. And then finally, I'm just going to add in 30 pixels of margin at the top of this element. And now below this, I'm going to add in yet another text element, but this is just going to be used to indicate what particular field a user is going to input information into. So under our visual elements, I'm going to grab another text element here, and I'm going to have this text element just display the word phone, because this is where a user is going to add in the details of their phone number. I will remove the style of this just because I want to bold this text, but I won't make any other changes. I will, however, jump to my layout tab because I'd like to update the responsive settings of this text element. I'm going to once again unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. I'm then going to set the minimum height to be 0, making sure I have ticked the option to fit the height of this element to the content within it. And then finally, when it comes to our margins, I'm going to add in 20 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the left and 20 on the right. I won't worry about adding any on the bottom, but what you'll now see is that this text element will never touch the borders of my page, regardless of how wide or how small this is. It's never going to touch. Then back in my UI builder, I'd like to add my first input field onto the page. And so an input field, as the name suggests, allows users to input information that we can then store within our database. And so if we scroll on down, you'll see the option to add in a list of input fields. And we're going to select from the very first option, which is just a standard input field here. The first thing I'm going to do is actually update the name of this input field. So within my property editor, I'm going to click at the top here, and I'm going to call this input phone number. And the reason I'm doing this is because later on, when I actually build out the workflows to register someone's account, I just want to be able to clearly identify which particular data is stored within which particular field. And so if I call this the input phone number, I know that this is where the user is adding their phone number. Now, when it comes to this input field, before I update its responsive settings, I'm also going to want to update the style of it. So you could see within my existing editor before, my input fields just have a small green line below them, which just replicates the real world WhatsApp product. And this is an experience we can easily create. But instead of removing the style of this particular input field, what I'm actually going to do is choose to create a new style. Now, if you're not too familiar with styles within Bubble, they're just a way to create a repeatable design pattern that saves you having to update the style every single time for a particular element. And so essentially what you'll see within my existing editor here is that I have 3 input fields that look the exact same. So instead of having to remove the style and edit these individually, what I can do is create a style that I'm going to reuse multiple times within my app. And then I can easily just update the style of each input to reference those settings instead of having to change the settings for each element. And so I'm going to jump back into my Bubble editor here and choose to create a new style. I'll call this input register page. I'll then create this. And then from here, I can choose to edit the style of this input field. And what you'll see is that we have all of the same configurations as before that we can customize. And within our style here, what I'm going to do is start by just removing the background style. So at this point, it just has a flat color. I'm going to set this to be none. And what you'll see is a real-time preview here of what our element will look like with the style settings. I'm then going to scroll on down to the border of our input field and just tick this option here to define each border independently, which just means that I can remove certain borders around this input field. So I'm going to choose to set the top border as none. I'll set the right border as none. I'll leave the bottom border as solid, although I would just like to set the border curvature to be 0, and then also update the color of this border to be a shade of green that I've used on my group. So once again, that color code is 25D366. And then I'll also set the left border to be none. And then if I was to jump back into my design tab here, I can select away from my input field. And what you'll see is that that now replicates the exact same design style that I've just created. And so the last thing we'll need to do for this input field is just update the responsive settings of it. So I'm going to jump to our layout tab here. And like all of our previous elements, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. When it comes to the height, however, I will leave this as the default option. So at this point in time, the height is fixed at 45 pixels. And I'm going to leave that as so because I think that is an adequate amount of height for this particular input field. So it just means that because it's fixed, it's going to be no higher or no smaller, which is completely fine. The only other thing I will do is just add in 20 pixels of margin on the left and 20 pixels of margin on the right, just to ensure that this input field doesn't touch the borders of my page. Then from here, I'm going to select both my text and my input field. I'm going to make a copy of these. I can then move my text down below my first input field, and I'll just update the text that's displayed here to show the word email, because within our next field, I'd like to allow a user to add in their email address. And so I'm going to select on our second input field here, and I'm going to first of all start by updating the name to be called input email, so that way I know to reference this particular input field when I register someone's account. The only other change I'll need to make to this field is that I'd like to update the content format here. So at this point in time, it's set to be a text format, which just essentially means that users can add text into this field. What I'd like to do is actually set the content format to be an email, which just means that Bubble's going to verify that a user needs to add in a proper email address into this field. So it'll need to finish with @theirdomain.com or @gmail.com. And that's everything I'll need to change here. I'm going to make one last copy of my text and my input field. I'll drag my text element down, and I'll have this display the word password. And of course, as you probably guessed, I'm going to select on my input field here. I'll update this to be called input password. And then finally, I'm going to update the content format of this to be a password as well, which just means it's going to hide any characters added within this particular field. And now the very last thing I'd like to add onto our page is just going to be a button, which when clicked will run a workflow to register someone's account within our platform. So I'm going to scroll on up to our visual elements, and I'll add a button onto our page. And I'm going to have this button display the words sign up. And now when it comes to the styling of this button, I'm going to actually once again choose to edit an existing style here, which is our primary button. The reason I'm going to edit the style instead of just removing this style is because I'd like to reference any changes I make to this button across other pages in my app. And so I'm going to choose to edit the style of my primary button here. I'm going to just jump to the background color, and I'm going to change this to be the same green color code that I've used before, which if you'd like that again, it's 25D366. And then finally, I'll just update the roundness of the borders for this button to be 10, just so that way the edges are slightly more curved. I'll then jump back into my design tab here. And the last thing I'll need to do is update the responsive settings of this button. So I'm going to jump to my layout tab here. Similar to all of my existing elements, I will unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. And now for the height of this button, I'm happy to leave the height at 45 pixels there. The only other setting I'll need to change is just the margins around this button. So I'm going to add 30 pixels of margin at the top, 20 pixels of margin at the bottom, 20 pixels of margin on the left, and also 20 pixels of margin on the right. And now from here, what we can do is build out our first workflow in our application, which is just going to run a process every single time this button is clicked. And so what we're going to do is choose to start a workflow whenever this sign up button is clicked here. And within this, we're going to head to our account workflow action, and we're going to select the sign the user up event. And as you'll see here within our workflow, we'll now need to match a relevant email and password to this user's account. And of course, we can easily reference the values that someone adds within the input fields on our page. So for our email field within our database, I'd like this to equal the value of the input email field on our page. Then for our password, I'd like this to equal the value of our input password on our page. And what I also love about Bubble is that throughout this particular step here, you'll see we have the option to also update any additional data fields we'd like to store within a user's account. Now at this point within our tutorial, we've of course allowed someone to add their phone number into the relevant input field. And so what I'm going to do is select to change another field within this user's account. And that field will be their phone number. And I'd like this to equal the value of the input phone number field on our page. And just like that, that is all we'll need to do in order to register someone's account within our database. It's that simple. One thing I would just like to point out though is that at this point in time, a user would come to our registration page, they'd add in all their details, they'd choose to sign up an account. That workflow would successfully run and it would create an account within our database. However, at this point in time, a user would just remain stagnant on this page. Nothing would happen, so they wouldn't really know if the account was created or not. And so what I'd like to do is actually create another step within our workflow that's going to redirect someone through to a settings page within our app. Just because once they've registered an account, if we send someone to a settings page, it will allow them to add any additional details they'd like to store within their account. So things like their profile photo, their name, or even their bio. And so what I'm going to do is jump back into my workflow editor here, and I'm going to add an additional step within my workflow. So after the user signs up an account, we're going to add another action. And in this case, we're going to choose a navigation event, and we'll choose the go to page action. So this is going to send someone through to a destination page. Now at this point in time, our destination page does not yet exist because we haven't created it. So we're going to choose to create a new page here, and we're going to call this the settings page. I'll just choose to create this. And now I can set that the destination page that someone should be sent to will in fact need to be our new settings page here. And that actually is everything I'd like to add within this particular workflow. And it also just completes the whole process of creating a registration page. What I'd love to do is just jump into a preview of our application so I can show you how this page is going to function. Over in my user registration page here, you can see that because I'm on a desktop device, our page has completely expanded out. But of course, I'd just like to point out that this page is going to be completely responsive here. And so what I can do is choose to add in all of the details of my account that I'd like to create. I'm just going to add in a fictitious phone number, as well as an email address, and then a super secure password. And from here, I'm going to select to sign up an account. That workflow would run. It's going to create an account for me within my database, and then it's going to redirect me through to my settings page, as you'll see within our URL here. Of course, just at this point in time, this page has nothing on it, so it's just going to be blank. If I was to jump back into my Notion checklist, I'm just going to tick off that we've finished building out the process to register a user's account. And throughout that, I just explained how we could obviously store information like a user's email and password, as well as their phone number. And then once they've registered an account, how we could redirect them through to our new settings page. Moving through my list of features I have set up for us in my Notion doc today, I actually just wanted to jump ahead to the feature of building out our dedicated WhatsApp homepage, just because there's quite a bit involved within this process. And when it comes to the real-world WhatsApp homepage, you'll notice that this contains a search bar, so that way users are able to filter through a list of all of the messages that they're a part of. And then also on the homepage, it displays a list of all of the chats that a user is partaking in. And this is an experience we can easily replicate within our own Bubble app today. And now I actually just wanted to break the process of building out our homepage into a couple of different modules. And so by the end of this specific module, we'll have the overall baseline of our homepage for us to then go ahead and build some additional features like being able to add new contacts, as well as then later on create new chats. So let's go ahead and jump into our Bubble editor here. Now I've opened up my index page here, which if you remember was the standard page that came by default within any brand new Bubble editor. And at this point in time, this page should be blank. There's nothing on it. And essentially the index page just refers to your main default page within your application. So 9 times out of 10, this is going to be your home page. And so like always, the first thing I'm going to do is open up my property editor here for my page. And I'm just going to update the background color to be a light shade of gray temporarily, just so I can see where it sits within my editor. I'm then going to jump over into my layout tab because of course I'll need to update the container layout of this page. Now, like any other page I've built so far in my tutorial, I'd like to stack this page from top to bottom. So I'm going to set the container layout to be a column. I'll then also set the preset page width to be a mobile, so that way it is the size of a mobile device. And then we can start building out all of the elements we'd actually like to add onto this page. Now the first thing I'd like to add is almost going to be like a little header menu, which just displays 2 elements side by side. On the left hand side I'm going to have a title, and then on the right hand side I'm going to have a little icon, which when clicked will later on display a pop-up that allows someone to create a new contact or a new chat. And so because I'd like to display these 2 elements side by side, I'm going to actually need to add a group onto my page and set that container layout to be a row. So I'm going to scroll on down to my containers here, and I'll choose to add a group element onto my page. Like always, when I add groups onto my page, I'm just going to update the background style to be a flat color, and I can also update that to be just a light shade of red for the time being. Of course, we can change that back to normal whenever we preview or publish our app, but just while we're working on an app, that's going to allow me to see where this sits on my actual page. I'm then going to jump to the layout tab of this group and set the container layout to be a row, because as I mentioned, I'm going to be adding two elements in this which are going to be side by side. So if I'm stacking things horizontally, I'll need to make it a row. I'll then just update the width settings of this group to be fully responsive. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite, which just means that this group can be as small or as large as possible on our page. And then from here, I can start to add in my two elements that I'd like to display. And as I mentioned, the very first element is going to be a text heading on the left-hand side of my page. So I'm going to scroll on up to my visual elements and just add a text element in. And when it comes to this text element, I'm going to have this just display the word chats. And I'm going to choose to remove the style of this text because I'd like to make a couple customizations. I'm going to set the font size here to be 36. I'm also going to choose to bold this font. And that's all I'll need to change here. What I will of course need to do is just go and update the responsive settings of this text within my layout tab here. So when it comes to this text here, I'm going to, like always, unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. So once again, it'll take up as little or as much space as it possibly can. I'm also going to set my minimum height to be 0, which just means that it's going to collapse nicely around this text here. And then finally, the very last thing I'll do is just vertically align this text in the center of my red group. And that's everything I'll need to change for this particular element. Now on the other side of my red group here, I'd like to add a little icon which looks like a little pencil, which just indicates that when someone clicks that, they'll be able to create something. And of course, the thing they'll be able to create is either a new contact or a new chat, but we'll be building those features out in a moment. For now though, I just want to head to my visual elements and add that icon onto my group here. And when it comes to the icon itself, I'm just going to type in the word pencil, and I'll be selecting this pencil icon. I'm also just going to choose to remove the style of this, because I'd like to update the color to be a different shade of blue, which if you'd like that color code, it's 3741FA. And this is just a similar color to the design that WhatsApp uses within their real world app. I'm then going to jump over to my layout tab because of course I'd like to update the size of this icon. It's quite big at the moment. When it comes to the width, I'm going to set this as 30 pixels. And for the height, I'm also going to set that as 30 pixels. And I am going to leave these options selected here to make this a fixed width and a fixed height. And the reason I'm doing that is because I'm only ever going to want this icon to be 30 pixels by 30 pixels. I don't want it to grow or shrink based on the size of the page. I always want it to be this size. And then from here, I'm also going to vertically align this in the center of my red group. So that way it's perfectly in line with my text element beside it. And now after editing that, that's everything I'll need to add into my red group. So I'm going to click on the red group itself. I'll open up our layout tab here. And because we have the option selected to fit the height of this element to the content inside of it, I'm going to set the minimum height to be 0. And what you'll now see is that it's going to collapse nicely around all of our elements within it. And then finally, the last thing I'd like to do for this group is just add in 20 pixels of margin on the left and 20 pixels of margin on the right, which will just ensure that these elements don't touch the side borders of my actual page. And now below this little header section here, I'd just like to add a search box. And essentially later on, we're going to create a search experience that filters out all of our chats on our home page by the person's name that someone types into this search box. But for now, we're just going to actually take the time to add that search box onto our page. So if we scroll on down to our input forms, you may have noticed that there actually is an input field called a search box. And now if you're not familiar with the search box itself, it integrates directly within your Bubble database. So if you were to start typing in the value of someone's name, it will automatically provide you with a suggestion of any data you have that matches that value. And while that element is quite helpful for some instances, and we will be using it throughout our build today, At this point in time, I'm actually just going to choose to add in a regular input field, and I'm going to make this look like a search box. And the reason I'm doing this is because I don't want the functionality of a regular search box for this particular field. I want it to function more like an input field, where someone can just type in a value, and then I'm essentially going to add a list of users, and I'm going to later on recognize that I'd like to display all of the users whose name matches the value put within our input field. And of course, I'll be explaining that in more detail when we get to it. But for the time being, I'd just like to add an input field onto my page here. And when it comes to the name of this input, I'm going to update this to be called input search main page, because this is going to be my main search box I add today. I'm then going to choose to remove the style of this input here, because I just like to update the color of its background. I just have a light shade of gray here, which looks more like the real world WhatsApp product. And if you'd like that color code, it's F0, F0, F0. I'm also just going to scroll on down and update the roundness of the borders for this element to be 10, just so that way they're slightly more curved. And then if I scroll on up to my placeholder text here, I'm just going to have this display the word search. And so placeholder text essentially just displays a word until someone clicks into this field and starts typing in their own value. So this is just going to prompt someone that they can actually search within this field. I'm then going to jump to my layout tab, because of course I'd like to make this element fully responsive. So like always, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. So we can either shrink or expand regardless of the size of the page. I'm also just going to leave the height as the current option. So it's currently fixed at 45 pixels. And that essentially just means that this search box is always going to be this height, which I'm quite happy with because it's currently a good size. And then from here, I'll just add in some margins around this search box. So I'm going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the left, and 20 on the right. And that'll ensure that this element matches the same settings as the group I've added above it there. And at this point, you can start to see our homepage is coming together nicely. However, below this, of course, I'd like to add in a list of chats. And this is where things can get a little bit more complex. So I'm going to be sure to explain everything in as much detail as I can. And now, when it comes to displaying a list of things within your Bubble application, there's an element that allows you to do this quite easily. So if we head to our containers menu, you'll see there's an option here to add in what's called a repeating group. And this repeating group is just going to look like a bit of a spreadsheet in a way. So you can see there's a list of different cells. And so a repeating group is essentially how you can create a list of things, as I've just mentioned. And the best example of when a repeating group can come into play is, let's say you're building a social network like Instagram, and you want to create a feed of posts on your homepage that all dynamically change based on a person's interests or the people they follow. Essentially, a repeating group is the element you would use to bring that to life. So it displays a list of items that can be dynamically pulled from your database. And that list of items can be unique to every user that has an account within your application. So it's almost like how you would create a feed of something. And when you're working with a repeating group, you only need to add elements into your top cell, and it will automatically populate every other cell for you. So it truly is one of the most powerful elements you'll come across when you're working in Bubble. And as I mentioned, if you ever need to display a list of items, a repeating group is the element you will use. So you're going to be using this more than once. And when it comes to our repeating group, before I update any of the responsive settings, I'm going to jump to my appearance tab, because what you'll see is that our repeating group by default needs to have a data source. And that's because if it's displaying a list of items from our database, it needs to know which items it should in fact display. And so in this case, I'm going to set the type of content here to be a chat, which now means that our repeating group is going to display a list of chats within our database. But of course, I'm going to need to give this a data source so our repeating group knows which chats to display. And so if I was to click on our data source here, I'm going to perform a search through my database for all of the chats where the chat users, so if you remember in our database, this was a list of users that we were going to be adding into the chat, and where the chat users contains the current user, I would like to display that chat. So essentially now within this list, it's only going to display all of the chats where they at least contain the current user. And the current user is of course the person who is logged in viewing their homepage. And now I'd also like to sort these chats in a particular order. And so I'm going to want the most recently active chat to be positioned at the top of my list. And so the way in which I can do this is by sorting these chats by their last message date, which is essentially just a timestamp of when the last message was sent within a chat. And if I set the descending value of this to be yes, it's going to place the most recent chat at the top. From here, I can then close our data source because that's all we'll need to change there. And it's at this point that we can now start to customize the layout and design style of our repeating group before we start to add all of our elements inside of it. Before we do that though, just one small personal preference I have is that when I'm working with repeating groups, if I was to click away here, you can see there's lines between every cell, but there's no actual border around it. So I can't actually see where it lies on my page without hovering over it. What I like to do is actually just choose to remove the style of our repeating group while we're working on it. And I'm just going to add a solid border around this so I can actually see where it sits. Of course, when you go to preview or publish your app, you can remove that border. But just for the time being, it's a helpful little insight that I like to use. And then another thing we'll need to change with our repeating group is the number of rows and columns we'd like to display. So if I was to unselect both of these options here, you'll see there's just going to be an infinite number of rows and cells. However, within our tutorial today, I was actually quite happy with the layout it had before. So I'm going to keep the number of fixed columns to be 1, which just means that there's going to be one entry on every single line within our repeating group. However, I'm going to keep the option unselected to have a fixed number of rows. So if this was to be a fixed number of rows, it would only display 4 entries within my database. So essentially the first 4 chats. Whereas if I was to unselect that this should be a fixed number of rows, this is going to indefinitely display all of the chats that a user belongs to. And look, if they only have 1 or 2 chats, it's only going to display the first 1 or 2. Whereas if they've got 10, it's going to display all 10. And so that's the exact experience I want to create today. I will come back in a moment and update this height setting here. But for the time being, I'd like to jump into my layout tab. And because our repeating group itself is technically a group element, we'll also have the ability to update the container layout, which is going to determine where all of the elements will be positioned inside of the repeating group itself. And now within our repeating group for our chats, I'd like to display a couple of items horizontally. So I'd like to display the profile photo of a person that someone is messaging, as well as their name followed by the most recent message sent within that chat. And then later on, we're going to be displaying a notification icon if there's an unread message. And so because I'd like to display all of these elements horizontally, I'm going to set the container layout to be a row. I'm then going to need to make this element fully responsive across my page. So like always, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. And if I was to open up my responsive menu here, what you'll see is that this repeating group is now fully responsive, regardless of my page size. I'm then going to jump back to my UI builder here. I'm going to come back and update my height later on in a moment. But at this point in time, I'd like to add in all of the elements I want to display inside of this repeating group, before I then finalize some of the additional design settings for the repeating group itself. And now, as I mentioned, when it comes to this repeating group, I'm going to display some elements horizontally. The first element I want to add is going to be a picture element that's going to display the profile photo of the opposing person within this chat. So let's say you and I were having a chat on WhatsApp and you were logged into your account. You would want to see my profile photo if you were talking to me, whereas if I was logged into my account, I would want to see your profile photo. And so that's an experience that we can easily create today. We're going to head to our visual elements and choose to add an image element into our repeating group here. And when it comes to this image itself, because it sits within our repeating group that has a data source, we can actually reference each individual chat that this image sits within. So if I was to choose to insert dynamic data for this particular image here, I can reference what's called the current cells chat. And so in this list of chats that we're displaying, the current cell here would be cell number 1. So that means that this image would display the profile photo of someone within our first chat. In cell number 2, it would display the profile photo of someone within our second chat. And it would continue on through cell 3, 4, 5, and just indefinitely. And so in this case, I want to reference the current cell's chat. And now you'll see I have access to all of the data fields within each chat. And in this case, I just want to reference the chat users, because at this point in time, there's going to be 2 users within a chat. Of course, when we build out our group chat feature later on, I'll be explaining some different settings that we can add. But for the time being, let's just assume there's going to be 2 people within a chat. So back to my example before, there's you and I in a chat. But of course, because I'm displaying a one profile photo here, I only want to display the image of one person. And at this point in time, our chat users contains 2 people. And so what I'm going to do is just type in the word minus here. And you'll see the option to minus an item from this list. And so from this list of 2 users, I would like to minus the current user. And so back to my example before, if you were logged into your account, you would be the current user. And so if I was to take you away from that list, the only person remaining would be me, the person you were messaging, which means that you can now easily see my profile photo. And so essentially, if I was to scroll on down, I'd be able to display each item's profile photo. And what it means by each item is that essentially because we have a list of users, it's going to display every person's profile photo. But of course, because there's only one person left in that list, it's only going to display one profile photo. So I'm going to select this each person's profile photo here. And that's exactly how we can create the experience that displays the opposing person's message. And what you'll also see is that because we've added this element in the top cell of our repeating group, it also duplicates it across every other cell in our repeating group. So you essentially only need to design it once and then it will populate everything else for you dynamically. While we're working on this image, I'm going to scroll on down here and just update the border of this image to be solid, just so that way I can see where it actually sits within my repeating group. I'm also then just going to click on my image again and update the roundness of this to be 100, so that way it will become a perfect circle. And then from here I can jump to my layout tab, because of course I'd like to update the design style of this particular image. And now when it comes to this image, I'm going to set the width of this to be 50 pixels. I'm going to select this option to keep this image's aspect ratio fixed. And if I keep it at a 1:1 ratio, it's going to make it 50 pixels by 50 pixels, so it becomes a perfect square. And I am going to keep this option selected to make this a fixed width as well, just because I'm only ever going to want this to be 50 pixels. I don't want it to expand or contract based on the size of the page. The only other thing I'm going to change here is that I'm going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, but I won't add any other margin around this particular element itself. And now beside this element, I'd like to display the name of the person who someone is messaging, as well as beside that, the date that the last message was sent within this chat, as well as the actual text of that last message itself. And this is where things can get a little bit confusing throughout our build, just because the way I'm going to design this is going to require a couple of different groups that are going to stack on top of each other. And the reason is because if I was to show you an example of what this page is going to look like, here's a version I prepared earlier. So essentially within our repeating group cell here that displays our chat, I not only have the profile photo of the person who someone is messaging, so that's the profile photo we've just added, but beside this I have the name of the person that someone is messaging, which is this text here in bold. Then beside this, I have the date of the very last message that was sent within this chat. And then below that, I have the actual text of the last message itself. And now you might remember that the container layout of our overall repeating group here is set as a row, which means it's going to display elements side by side, which is exactly what we want here. But as you'll see, these elements are actually stacked on top of each other. So this red group here, I've essentially created this group so I could set the container layout to be a column. So that way I could stack these elements on top of this element here. But what you'll also see is that within this red group, I have a green group. And the purpose of the green group is to set its container layout to be a row, because I'm stacking these 2 elements side by side. And so this is where things can get a little bit confusing if you are relatively new to Bubble. Essentially, in order to create the exact experience we want today, we are going to have to stack and move around a couple of different group elements. And this is where, to my point earlier on about color coding groups, comes into fruition. So if you color code your groups, it kind of makes it like you're just stacking Lego blocks. So it's much more easy to visually see what you're creating. But of course, I'm here to walk you through every step of the way for this. So we're going to jump back into our main Bubble editor here. And the first thing I'm going to do is add in a group inside of my existing repeating group cell. And if I jump over to my appearance tab, I'm going to remove the style of this group. I'm going to set the background style to be a flat color. And this is going to be my red group, which is going to stack my elements vertically. So if I jump over to my layout tab, I'm going to set the container layout to be a column because I'll be stacking elements on top of each other. The only setting I'm going to change here is just the responsive width settings for this group. So I'm going to, like always, unselect that this should be a fixed width. And if I set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite, it's going to take up as little or as much space as it can within our repeating group here, which of course means it's now going to move beside our overall repeating group because the repeating group has a container layout of a row. Within this red group here, the first thing I'm going to actually add is just that text element you saw at the bottom before I then go on and add in the additional group above it there. So I'm going to add a text element into this group here. And now one thing I should point out is that because this text element doesn't actually sit directly within our repeating group, it technically sits within a group that's inside of our repeating group, you'll see that we can't actually reference the chat within our repeating group. And that's just because we're going to need to pass some data on from our repeating group into this red group, which then our text element can reference because of course it sits inside of that group. So if I click on my red group here, you'll see that like our repeating group, I have the option to add a type of content into this group. So if I set the type of content to be a chat, it's going to now allow me to store one particular chat within this group. And the chat I would like to store is going to be the current cell's chat. So because our red group sits within our repeating group, we can easily pass that data on. And now if I click on this text element here, you'll see I can reference what's known as the parent group's chat. So because this element sits inside of the red group, that red group is known as its parent because it takes responsibility for this text element. And so when it comes to this particular text element, you can now see that I can reference the parent group's chat. However, that's not actually the option I'm going to select. So in the case of this text element, I'd like to display the contents of the very last message sent within this chat. And of course, if you remember in our database, our message was a separate data type to our chat. So if I was to open up my data tab over here, you'll remember that I have a message data type, and within every single message, I'm linking that to a chat. So what I'm essentially going to want to do here is search through my database for all of the messages that belong to this particular chat. And I'm just going to display the very last message that was sent within that chat. And I'm going to display the first 100 characters of it. And so I'm going to insert dynamic data here. And I'm going to actually perform a search through my database for all of the messages where the chat that it belongs to equals the value of the parent group's chat. So that is the chat within our red group here. And in this case, I'm just going to reference the very last item. So that is the last message sent within that chat. I'd like to display its message content, which is the actual text of the message itself. But instead of displaying the full message, I'm only going to want to display a preview of that message. And in this case, I will only want to display the first 100 characters of that message. So I'm going to select this more option. And if I was to scroll on down, you'll see the option to truncate to. And essentially what truncating means is that if I was to type in the number 100 here, it would only display the first 100 characters and then cut it off, which means I can just add in a ... just to show that this is in fact a preview of the first 100 characters of this full message. And now I know that was a lot to take in, particularly if you are new to Bubble, but I do just want to move on from here to my layout tab because I'd like to update the responsive settings of this text element. I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. Like always, I'll be leaving the minimum width as 0, the maximum width is infinite, so that way it takes up as little or as much space as it's allocated. I'm then also going to set the minimum height to be 0 because we have this option selected here to fit the height of this element to the content inside of it. And then for this text element, I'm just going to add in 5 pixels of margin at the top here. And that's all I'm going to change for now. Then of course above this, I'm going to want to add in that separate group I'd mentioned. So this is my green group here, which has a container layout of a row, which is going to allow me to stack 2 text elements side by side. So I'm going to jump to my containers menu here. I'm going to add in a group, and by default this is just going to display below my text. If I would like, I can move this to the previous position within my red group, and it will now move it to the top. I'm going to jump to my appearance tab first and just remove the style of this. So that way the background style can be a flat color, and this is going to be that light shade of green. I'm just going to keep it in line with the example I'd shown you before. And now when it comes to this group, because it of course sits within my red group, I'm going to need to once again pass the data on into this group so I can reference it for all of my text elements. So for the type of content, I'm going to once again display a chat within this green group. Only this time, because my green group sits inside my red group, I'm going to pull data from my parent group's chat, which is the chat stored within my red group, which is of course pulling that from my repeating group. It's kind of like a little Russian doll where everything is connected and it continually opens up like a big web. But now from here, I'd also just like to jump into my layout tab, because I'll need to update the container layout of this particular group to now be a row. So this is going to allow me to stack elements side by side. I'm also just going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. Like always, I'll set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite, which is just going to make it fully responsive. And now the first text element I'd like to add within this group is going to be the name of the person who the current user is messaging. And so the data source of that text element is going to be pretty much the exact same as the profile photo we had displayed here. So if I scroll on up to my visual elements, I'm going to add a text element in. I'm going to insert dynamic data and reference the parent group's chat, its list of chat users, which to my example before is going to be 2 people, you and I in this chat. Then I'm going to minus an item from this list, and I'm going to minus the current user, which is only going to leave me with one person who is not the current user, so the person that they're messaging. And in this case, I'm going to scroll on down and display each item's name. And of course, because there is only one item, it's only going to display that person's name. I'm then going to choose to remove the style of this, just because I'd like to bold this text here. And then from here, I'm going to jump to my layout tab. And like always, I'm going to need to update the responsive settings of this particular text element. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite, meaning this is going to be fully responsive. I'm then going to set the minimum height as 0, so that way it's going to collapse nicely around the text element itself. And then from here, I'm going to add in one last text element inside my green group. And what you'll see is that because the container layout of my green group is a row, it's going to allow me to stack these horizontally. And so when it comes to this text element, I just like to display the date that the last message was sent on for this chat. And so the data source for this is going to be relatively straightforward. I'm just going to insert dynamic data, and I'll reference the parent group's chat, the last message date, which if you remember in our database is stored as a date. And then I'm going to choose to just format this as this particular date style. I can then close this. That's all I'll need to change. I'm not going to change any of the formatting styles. I will just jump to my layout tab though. And I'm going to start by moving this to the next position within my group, just so that way it sits to the right hand side. I'm also then just going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. I'll set the minimum height as 0. And one thing I actually will need to change, is that I'm going to jump to my appearance tab. I am actually going to remove the style of this, just because I'd like to align this text over to the right hand side, just so that way it will always be positioned over in this corner. And now that's all I'll need to add into this particular green group. If I select on my green group here, I'm going to jump to my layout tab. And before I update any of my height settings here, what I'm actually going to do is update what's called the container layout of this group. So because I have my container layout set to be a row, it's going to of course stack elements side by side, so horizontally. But what Bubble allows me to do is determine the alignment of these elements inside of my group. So do I want to align all of these to the left, so that way they're pushed over to the side? If I wanted, I could align all of these in the center or to the right. But what I'm interested in doing is selecting this option here, which is the space between option. And this just essentially means that if I was to expand my page out, both of these elements are going to be positioned on the side, and they're going to have an even amount of space between them there. And that's just going to create this experience where the name is going to always sit on the left-hand side, and the date of the last message within this chat is always going to be positioned on the right-hand side. I'll jump back into my UI builder here, just because I'd now like to update the minimum height of this group to be 0. And because I have the option selected to fit the height of this element to the content within it, it's going to collapse nicely around all of my text elements there. And then from here, I can actually click into my red group, which if you remember, our green group actually sits within. And I can now update its minimum height to also be 0, which means it's going to collapse around all of these elements here. I'm then going to scroll on down to my margins and add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the bottom, and 10 on the left. I won't add any on the right because I'll add the actual margins on my repeating group itself in a moment. But as you'll see, at this point in time, you can start to see our chats coming together within our list here. I know it looks quite messy, almost like a rainbow cake at this point, just because we've got all of these different colors here. But when I show you a preview of this later on throughout our tutorial, this is actually going to look quite nice, like the real world WhatsApp experience. And although all of this text looks bunched up here because it's got 4 different rows, what you'll just need to remember is that someone's name is going to be 1 row at max. So all of these groups are going to collapse and fit that text quite nicely. So it's going to create the exact same experience as WhatsApp. From here though, I'm going to click on my overall repeating group because I finished adding in all of my elements inside of it. I'm then going to update its height here. So because we have the option to fit the height of this element to the content within it, if I set the height here to be 0, it's going to collapse around all of the elements inside of our repeating group. Another thing I should also point out is that over in our appearance tab, repeating groups are a little weird in the sense that they have 2 minimum heights. So there's our minimum height in our layout tab, but there's also the minimum height of each row. And now at this point, I'm just going to also set that to be 0. And that's just going to ensure that there is no minimum height. So essentially, if I need to display less than the 100 pixels that was allocated here, it's going to collapse below that. That's all I'll change there though. The last thing I want to do is just jump into my layout tab here, because I just like to scroll on down to my margins and add in 20 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the left, and 20 on the right. And what that'll ensure is that my repeating group doesn't touch the borders of my overall page. And to be honest, that's everything I want to cover up to this point in our homepage module of our tutorial today. I know technically we haven't really built a lot on the page, but as you can see, when it comes to the repeating group, there was a lot of work that had to go into making that functional. And although if I was to show you a preview of this right now, this repeating group wouldn't actually display, just because it's searching through a list of chats in our database and we haven't yet created a chat. I do just want to point out that this homepage would be fully functional in that it would display a list of chats. But for the time being, I'm just going to jump back into my Notion checklist because I'd like to tick off that I've finished building out the homepage. And throughout this experience, I not only covered how we could add in our menu, our search box, as well as our list of chats, but I also explained how we could display the opposing user's details within a chat. So that was the details of the person who was not the current user. Moving down through our list of features, the next thing I want to cover within our build today is the process of adding a new contact to someone's own contact list. So essentially, in order to be able to message someone, they're going to need to first add them to their list of contacts. And now, while this is a relatively straightforward process, there are a few specific details involved. And I think that before I actually start building this experience out, I might just show you a demo of what this is actually going to look like. So over in a separate browser here, I have an existing version of my WhatsApp application. And essentially, when someone clicks on this little pencil icon in our top right-hand menu, I'd like to display this pop-up here, which is going to allow someone to essentially see a list of all of their contacts. They'll be able to filter through their contacts by searching someone's name. And of course, when they click on someone's name, it's going to create a chat. However, you'll also see we have 2 separate groups here. One to create a group chat and the other to add a new contact. Essentially, when someone clicks on this new contact group here, I'll want to hide this particular pop-up and then display another one, which is going to allow someone to search for someone's phone number and then choose to save them in their list of contacts. So you can just see there's a little bit involved within this experience, although there's not actually a whole lot we're displaying on these pop-ups. Of course, I'm going to be sure to explain everything throughout this process in as much detail as I can. But for the beginning, let's jump on over into our new bubble editor that we have here. And at this point in time, we built out the framework for our home page. The first thing I'd like to do is add a pop-up element onto my page. So I'm going to head to my containers menu. I'll add a pop-up anywhere. And now a pop-up is kind of like a group, only it's going to be displayed over your page. And when a pop-up is in fact being displayed, you'll see it adds almost like a layer of opacity on the top of your page, just so that way the focus itself is on the pop-up. And now when it comes to this pop-up, the first thing I'm going to do is update the name of this to be called pop-up new chat. So this is going to be the first of 2 pop-ups that we're going to be building in this section of our tutorial. When it comes to the design settings of this pop-up itself, I'm going to update the container layout to be a column because I'll be stacking elements in this from top to bottom. I'm also then going to unselect that this pop-up should be a fixed width. Like always, I'm going to set the minimum width as 0, meaning it will be able to contract down to the smallest possible size. However, at this point in time, I don't want to leave the maximum width as infinite because as you'll see at this point, it's become wider than our actual page. And so what I'm going to do is set a maximum width of 380 pixels. And the reason why I'm selecting 380 is because if you remember, if I was to open up my page property editor here, because we've set the preset width to be a mobile device, the width here is 380. So this just means that this pop-up will at any given point in time be no larger than our page itself. And now because I've hidden my pop-up, one thing I should point out is that if you ever want to open this element, you'll just need to scroll on up on your left-hand menu and open up what's called your elements tree here. So this is where you'll see a list of all of your elements on your page. And if I want to open up my pop-up, I can select on this little eye icon and it's going to open this up here. And now the first thing I'd like to add onto this pop-up is just going to be a text element. So I'm going to add this at the top here. And this is going to display the words new chat. So this is going to be our first pop-up where someone can view a list of all their contacts. I'm going to remove the style of this just because I'd like to update the font size to be 20. I'd also like to align this text in the center of the element itself. And then I'm going to choose to bold this text. I'll also then jump over into my layout tab here because of course I'll need to make this element fully responsive. So I'm going to unselect that this text element should be a fixed width. Like always, I'll be setting the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. I'll then also set the minimum height as 0. And because we have the option selected to fit the height of this element to the content inside of it, it's going to collapse nicely around that text. I'll then add in 20 pixels of margin around the top, the left, and the right-hand borders of this particular text element. So that way it doesn't touch the borders of my pop-up. And then below this text element, I'd like to add an input field, which is going to act like a search box, which later on will allow me to filter through a list of all of a user's contacts. So that way they can find a specific person that they would like to chat with. And to actually streamline this whole process, I'm just going to close my pop-up here. I'm going to click away. And I'm going to choose to just copy this existing search box on my page here. I'll then open my pop-up back up, click on the pop-up itself and paste this in. Only I'll just need to update the name of this. And I'll be calling this input search new chat. Just so that way later on I can reference that this is the search box on my new chat pop-up. But because I've copied that, it's going to of course copy across all of its responsive settings. So it's going to save me from having to design that yet again. And now below this, I'd like to add in my 2 groups that I'd shown you before. And of course, these groups are going to contain my options, which will allow me to create a group chat or add a new contact. And the reason why I've added these as groups is because as you'll see, I'm stacking 2 elements side by side, so horizontally, which just means that the container layout for this particular group is going to be a row, whereas the container layout for a pop-up was of course a column. So I'm going to jump back into my bubble editor here. I'm going to scroll on down to my containers menu and add a group element onto my page. The first thing I'm going to do for this element is jump over to my appearance tab. I will remove the style of this, add a flat background color, and like you saw in my example before, I'm going to make this a light shade of red, just so I can actually see where it sits on my pop-up. I'm then going to jump to my layout tab and update its container layout to be a row, so that way I can position 2 elements side by side. I will, like always, make this fully responsive by unselecting that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. And now before I update any of the height or the margin settings for this group, I'm going to add my elements inside of this. And one thing I should point out is that with the elements inside this, as you can see, I've got a text element here, but I've actually got an icon element that sits inside a small circle group here. And so I'm going to add that in first. So I'm going to jump over into my red group here, and I'm going to add yet another group inside of this. And this is going to be my small little circle. So I'm just going to jump over to my appearance tab here. I will remove the style of this, and I'm going to set this to have a flat background color. Only for this time, when it comes to the color, I'm going to set this to be a light shade of blue, which if you'd like that color code, it's C2C2FF. And I'm also just going to update the opacity of this to be 60, so that way it's somewhat see-through. I'm then going to update the roundness of this to be 100, so that way it becomes a perfect circle. Then I'll jump over to my layout tab, because I'll first of all need to update the container layout for this group. And to be honest, because we're only adding one element into this group, it doesn't really matter what the layout is between a row or a column. I'm just going to choose a row because it's going to give me some additional container alignment options here. But as I said, it doesn't really matter too much. I'm then going to jump to the width of this group, and I'm going to set this to be 40 pixels. And I'm also going to set the minimum height here to be 40 pixels. And I'm going to tick that should be a fixed value, as well as leave the width as a fixed value, which means this is going to be 40 pixels by 40 pixels, and it's never going to expand or contract. It's always going to be this size, which is exactly what I want. I'm then going to vertically align this in the center of my red group, and from here I can add my icon element that's going to sit inside of it. So if I scroll on up, I'm going to choose to add an icon element inside of my group here, and it's quite large, so it's going to sit outside of it. And if I just type in the word user, the first thing I'm going to do is add in this group of user aliases, which is just going to prompt someone that this is where they can create a group chat. And when it comes to the design style, I'm going to remove this just so I can set a custom icon color, which if you'd like that color code, it's 4043FF. I'll then jump into my layout tab here, and I'll update the width of this to be 20, the height of this to be 20, and I'll of course leave those both as fixed values because I'll always want them to be 20 by 20. I'm going to vertically align this in the center of my group. And if I was to click on my overall circle group, I'm going to update the container alignment to be centered as well, which just means that horizontally, this particular icon is going to sit directly in the middle of this group. So now it looks pixel perfect. And then finally, beside this element, I'd like to add in a text element, which is just going to prompt someone that this is where they can create a new group chat, which we'll be building out later on in our tutorial. So I'm going to head to my visual elements. I will add a text element here. And when it comes to this text element, I'm just going to have this display the words new group. I'll then just quickly remove the style of this because I'd like to add a color to this font. That color code is going to be the exact same as the icon color code. If you'd like it again, it's 4043FF. I'm then going to jump to my layout tab because of course I'll need to update the responsive settings of this text element. And like always, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite, which just means that this element can take up as little or as much space as it needs. I'll then set the minimum height to be 0, which means it's going to collapse nicely around all of the text inside of it there. And then I'm also just going to add in 10 pixels of margin on the left. And from here, I'm going to vertically align this element in the center of my red group. And you'll now see that it's going to be positioned directly beside our icon we've previously added. I'm then going to click on my red group because that's all I want to add into this group itself. For the height of this group, because we have the option selected to fit the height of this element to the content inside of it, I'm going to set the minimum height as 0 and it'll collapse nicely around our elements there. And then from here, I'm just going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the left and 10 on the right. I think I might also change my mind and open up the margins for our search field here and just update the left and right margins to be 10 instead of 20, just so that way it's also in line with our group here. And now this is our group that's going to allow someone to create a new group chat. Below this, I'd like to add another group that's going to allow someone to add a new contact. Before I do that though, I'm just going to update the name of this red group to be called group new group chat. Just because then I'll know when this is clicked later on, I can reference this when I want to create a workflow to create a new group chat. From here though, I'm just going to make a copy of this red group. I'll paste this in below. And all I'll need to do is first of all update the name of this group. I'm going to call it group new contact. I'll then update the text within this to display the words new contact. And then finally, I'm going to update the icon that sits within our blue group here. I'm going to once again search for our user icon. Only this time I'm going to display the little user icon with a plus symbol next to it. And for the time being, this is actually all I want to create on this pop-up. At a later point in our tutorial, I'm going to explain how we can add a list of users and then filter those using our search field here. But instead, I just want to take this time in our tutorial to focus more on how we can add a new contact. Before I do that though, I might just make one quick little change to my pop-up. So I'm going to click on this. I'm going to remove the design style here. And I'm just going to update the roundness of its borders here to be 10, just so it has some curved edges. Of course, one thing I should also point out is that by default, pop-ups are going to be hidden on your page. They're not displayed. They'll only be displayed when you call them within a workflow. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create a workflow that's triggered every single time this little pencil icon is clicked. In which case, I would then like to display that first pop-up on our page. And so I'm going to choose to start a new workflow whenever this icon is clicked. And this workflow is going to be pretty straightforward. If we scroll on down to our element actions here, I'm going to choose to show an element. And the element I'd like to show is going to be our pop-up new chat, which is the pop-up we've just created. Then from here, I'm going to jump back into my design tab. And I'm going to create that second pop-up I'd shown you before within my previous example. So this was the pop-up within my second browser here, which just allowed someone to search through a list of phone numbers to then add a contact to their contact list. And in order to streamline the process of creating this pop-up, I'm going to jump back to my original bubble editor here. I'm going to open up our pop-up we just created. I'm going to click on this and I'm going to make a copy of it. I'll then click away and paste in a new version of this. And I'm going to first of all click on this and update the name to be called pop-up new contact. I'll then choose to select the input field and both of my red groups, and I'll delete those. And from here, I can click on the text at the top of this pop-up, and I'll have this display the words new contact, just because we'll be prompting a user that this is in fact the pop-up that they'll be adding a contact through. And then of course below that, I'm going to need to add an input field, which will allow a user to search through a list of phone numbers to add a new contact. Before I do that though, I'm just going to add one last text element, which is going to prompt a user to type in a phone number. So if I head to my visual elements here, I'm going to add a text element, and I'll just have this display the word phone. I'd like to just remove the style of this because I just want to bold this text as well. Then of course, like always, I'll just need to update the responsive settings for this text element. So if I jump to my layout tab here, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. I'll also set the minimum height to be 0. And because this option is ticked, it's going to collapse around the text inside of it there. Then from here, I'm just going to add in 20 pixels of margin at the top, 10 pixels of margin on the left, and 10 pixels of margin on the right. And now below this, I can add in a search field, which is going to allow someone to search through a list of phone numbers in our database. And they can select which particular phone number they'd like to add to their contact list. So if I scroll on down to my input forms, you may remember that before I'd mentioned there is such a thing as a proper search box, not just an input field. And it's at this point in our tutorial that I'm going to show you how this search box will actually function. So we're going to add this dedicated search box in our field. And the first thing you'll notice is that the settings for this search box don't actually look the same as a regular input field. And that's because the search box allows you to dynamically search through data that's stored within your database. And so in our example today, we're going to have our search box reference all of the phone numbers saved in our database. And when a user types in someone's phone number, they're going to be able to select that particular user. And then our search box will store the value of the person they've selected. And we can then create a workflow that's going to allow us to add that person to someone's contact list. Before I do that though, the first thing I'm going to do is just update the name of this search box. And I'm going to call this search box new contact phone number. And although that's quite long, it's just going to allow me to easily reference this particular input when I build out a workflow in a moment. Now, when it comes to the fields I'd like to display within this search box, I'm going to update the placeholder text to display the word search. And of course, the placeholder text is just the text that's going to sit there until someone types into this field, which of course then brings me to my next point. When it comes to the list of choices for this search field, I'm going to have this search through a dynamic list in my database, although I'll just need to define what particular things my search box is going to search for. So if I select the option to define a list of options, the type of thing I'd like to search through in my database is going to be all of our users. And in this case, I'm going to perform a search through all of the phone numbers for every user. And then that will allow a user to type in a phone number and then find a match to the person who has that number. From here, I'm just going to also update the design style of this search box. So if I remove the style here, the only thing I'm interested in changing is just the borders around it. So at this point in time, you can see that it has a solid border around every single edge. Whereas what I'd like to do is instead choose to define each border independently. Then I'm going to remove every single border except for the bottom border. I'm going to keep that as is. So I'm going to set all of the options as none. I'll then set the curvature of that border to be 0. So that way it's just going to be a straight flat line there. Then from here, I'm of course just going to need to update the responsive settings of this search field. So I'm going to click on this element. I'll jump over to my layout tab. Like always, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. Now, when it comes to the height of this search box, I'm happy to leave this fixed at 45 pixels. So this essentially just means it's always going to be this height, which I'm fine with because that is a good height for this field. I'm then just going to add in 10 pixels of margin on the left, 10 pixels of margin on the right, just to ensure that it doesn't touch the borders of my actual pop-up. And then finally, the last element I'll need to add onto this particular pop-up here is just going to be a text element that displays the word save. And when that's clicked, that's when we're going to run a workflow to save someone as a contact for the current user. So I'm going to scroll on up here to my visual elements. I'll choose to add a text element onto my page. I'll have this display the word save. I'm going to remove the style of this element, just because I'd like to, first of all, update its alignment. I'm going to set this to be positioned on the right-hand side here. I'm then going to also update the color of this particular text. If you'd like this color code, it's 575FFF. And then I'm also going to choose to bold this text here. I'll then jump over to my layout tab because, of course, I'll need to make this text element fully responsive. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will, like always, set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. I'll set the minimum height as 0, making sure I've selected the option to collapse its height. And then finally, I'm just going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top. I'll add 20 on the bottom, then 10 on the left and 10 on the right. And from here, I can click on my overall pop-up because I'd like to now collapse the empty space here. So if I jump to my layout tab, I'm going to set the minimum height as 0. And once again, because we have this option ticked, it's going to collapse nicely around all of the elements inside of it there. Now, before I build out the workflow to actually create a new contact in our database, what I'm going to need to do is build out the workflow to actually display this pop-up. So you may remember that we previously created a workflow to display our first pop-up whenever this icon was clicked. And of course, that would then display our new chat pop-up. But what we're going to need to do is create a workflow that runs whenever this group here is clicked to create a new contact, in which case I'd then like to hide this pop-up and display our second one. So I'm going to jump to our appearance tab on this group here, and I'm going to choose to start a workflow whenever it or any elements inside of it is clicked. And in this case, I'm going to head to my element actions. I'd first of all like to hide an element, and that element is going to be our pop-up new chat. So this is the existing pop-up we're working with. Then after that, I'd like to show a pop-up. So I'm going to once again head to my element actions, and I'd like to show an element. And this element is now going to be my pop-up new contact. So that's now going to switch between my two pop-ups. From here, I'm going to close this new chat pop-up. I will open our new contact pop-up, and I can now create a workflow that runs whenever this save text is clicked. So I'm going to choose to start edit this workflow here. And within this workflow, there's going to be a couple of different steps, but it's a relatively straightforward process to build out. The first thing I'd like to do is add a person to the current user's list of contacts. So I'm going to head to my data events here and choose to make changes to a thing in my database. The thing I'd like to change is going to be the current user. So that is the person who is logged in and has just typed in someone's phone number and wants to add them to their contact list. And the field I'd like to change for this current user is going to be their contacts, which, if you remember, in our database is stored as a list of users. And in this case, I'd like to add to that list the person who has been displayed within our search box. So I'm going to just type in the word search here, and I'm going to reference the search box new contact phone number, its value. Because if you remember, although someone was typing in a phone number into that field, that search box was referencing a list of users in our database. So it's going to add the one user that was selected to this person's list of contacts. The next step I'd like to do is just a little bit of a personal preference of mine. I'd like to add an additional step here and just type in the word reset. And I'd like to reset relevant inputs. So essentially what that just means is that if a user was to type in a phone number here and they were to click save, it would technically add that person to that list of contacts, and then it's going to reset the value of this input field here. So that just means that there'll be no value. So that way, if a person then wants to consecutively add another new contact, they'll open this pop-up and this field will be blank, which is the exact experience we want to create. Then from here, I'm going to want to hide this pop-up and then revert back to our existing new chat pop-up here. And so back in my workflow editor, I'm going to add yet another step. I'll head to my element actions here, and I'm going to choose to hide an element. The element I'm going to hide is going to be our pop-up new contact. Then of course, I'm going to need to add an additional step. I'll head to our element actions, and I'd like to show an element. And that element, as you probably guessed, is our pop-up new chat. And that's everything I'd like to add within this workflow here. A personal preference I have is that if you're creating workflows that are related to a particular feature, I personally just like to color code my workflows, so that way I know that they are in fact dedicated to that specific feature. So if you click on the workflow trigger here, what you'll see is that you can update the event color. In this case, I'm just going to set the event color of all of these workflows to be blue. So I'm just going to jump ahead and update these here. And to be honest, that's everything I want to create within this particular step of our tutorial today. As I mentioned, we're still yet to add the repeating group onto our new chat pop-up here, which is going to display a list of contacts that someone has saved within their account. But what I want to do is just show you a quick little preview of how our app's going to function at this point in time, although we don't have a lot of data actually within our database. Over in a preview of my app here, I'm currently just logged in on my desktop to my account that I have previously created. What I'm going to do is just reduce the size of my browser here so it looks more like a mobile device. But of course, this page is going to be fully responsive if you are in fact using this on a mobile device. I'm then going to click on my icon here in the top right hand corner, and it's going to display my first pop-up. I'm then going to click on my new contact group here. It's going to hide that first pop-up, then display my second pop-up. And in this case, I can search through a list of phone numbers I have stored in my database. And in this case, I've just jumped ahead and I've created another test account. So I'm going to type in their phone number, and you'll see that it will actually provide me with a prompt to choose this particular user based off their phone number. If I was to then choose to save this as a contact, it's going to run that workflow. It'll save that in my database, and it's then going to revert me back to my first pop-up here. Of course, as I mentioned, later on, once we build out the repeating group of users here, that person would technically be displayed within this list, but for the time being, that's just going to be blank. Jumping back into my Notion checklist, I just want to tick off that we've finished walking through the process of creating a new contact within someone's account, which of course is an essential feature to any WhatsApp clone. As we start to make great progress through our list of features, the next thing I just wanted to cover is how we can actually build out the feature to create a new chat between two users. And this is arguably one of the more important features within any WhatsApp clone that you create. Because of course, before we can start sending and receiving messages within a chat, we first of all need to create that overall chat itself. So we're just going to jump over into our bubble editor here. And you may remember on our home page, we had previously added a pop-up, which is called our pop-up new chat. And now on this pop-up, I'd mentioned that below our list of buttons here where someone can select to add a new contact, I was planning on adding a list of users, which would display a list of a user's contacts that they have saved within their account. And it's at this point we're going to build that out, as well as build out the feature to filter that list of users using our search box here. And so of course, whenever we want to display a list of things, we're going to need to add a repeating group onto our page. So I'm going to scroll on down to my containers menu here, and I'll add a repeating group onto my page. And when it comes to this repeating group, the first thing I'll need to do, like always, is update the data source. So that way this repeating group knows which data from my database to actually display to a user. And in this case, I'd like to display a list of a user's contacts. So in that case, it's going to be a list of users from our database. So I'm going to set the type of content to be a user. And then for the data source, this is actually very straightforward. We don't actually need to perform a search through our database, because if you remember on our users data type, we're actually storing a list of users under a person's contacts. So we can easily just reference this list here. So if I jump to my design tab, all we'll need to do is just set the data source to be the current user, their list of contacts, which is a list of overall users. Then from here, I'm going to update the design style of my repeating group. What I'd like to do is display an indefinite list of a user's contacts itself. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed number of rows. I would just like to only display one person per row. So I am going to leave this as a fixed number of columns set as 1. Now, while I'm working on my repeating group, like always, I'm going to choose to remove the style of this just because I'd like to scroll on down and add a solid border around it. So that way when I click away, I can actually see where it lies on my overall pop-up. I'm then going to open up my layout tab for my repeating group, and I'm going to need to update, first of all, the container layout for this repeating group. And in this case, it's going to be a row, because I'd like to display two elements side by side. There's going to be the person's profile photo, followed by their name. And so because they're stacked horizontally, we're going to need to set the container layout to be a row. I'm then going to unselect that this element should be a fixed width. And like always, if I want to make something fully responsive, I'll be setting the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite, which just means that it can reduce to as small or scale to as large as it possibly needs to. I will of course come back and update the height and margin settings, but before I do that, I'll need to add my elements into this repeating group. And as I mentioned, this is a pretty straightforward repeating group to design. We're just going to scroll on up to our visual elements and start by adding an image element into this repeating group. And for the data source of this image, I'm going to insert dynamic data and just reference the current cells user. So that is the person that this repeating group is displaying. I'd like to display their profile photo. I'm then going to scroll on down to my borders and add a solid border around this image, and also set the roundness of this border to be 100, so that way it becomes a perfect circle. I'll then jump over to my layout tab, because of course I'd like to update the size of this image. And in this case, I'll be setting the width of this image to be 40 pixels, and I'll leave that as a fixed width. I'll also then set the height of this to be 40, and I'll select that this should be a fixed height, which now means that this image will always be 40 pixels by 40 pixels. Then I'm going to vertically align this in the center of my repeating group, and then finally add in just 10 pixels of margin at the top and 10 pixels of margin on the bottom, which is just going to ensure when I collapse the height of my repeating group in a moment, it won't actually touch the borders of my image. Now beside this, I just like to add in a text element, which is just going to display the name of this person within our repeating group. So I'm going to choose to insert dynamic data, and I'd like to display the current cells user, their name. It's as simple as that. I'd just like to bold this text as well. So I'm going to remove the style of this. I'll choose to bold the formatting of it. Then I can jump to my layout tab here, and I'm going to want to make this fully responsive. So I will unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width as 0, of course leaving the maximum width as infinite. The minimum height will also be 0, and then I will also vertically align this in the center of my repeating group here. And then finally, I'll just scroll on down and add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the bottom, and 10 on the left for this text element. I won't worry about adding any on the right. I'm going to actually add that margin on the repeating group itself. So I'm then going to click on my overall repeating group because that's all I'd like to add into it. I'll jump to my layout tab, and at this point in time, I'm going to set the minimum height of this to be 0. And I'll be selecting this option to fit the height of this repeating group to the content inside of it. But one thing you may notice is that there's still quite a bit of empty space around all of my text and my profile photo here. And that is, of course, because if I jump over to my appearance tab, as I'd mentioned in the past, repeating groups are a little strange in the fact that they have a height setting for the overall layout, but also a height setting for each individual row. So in this case, the minimum height is 100 pixels, which is this height here. So if I was to now set that to be 0, it would now collapse around all of the elements that sit inside of it. And although it only displays one cell of my repeating group, one thing I should point out is that if, let's say, a user had 20 contacts, it would display all 20. If they only had 1, it would just display the 1. One thing I also will do is jump over to my layout tab because I just like to add some margins around this particular repeating group. So I'm going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top. I'll add 20 on the bottom, 10 on the left, and 10 on the right. And because this is the very last element I'd like to add into my pop-up, I can now close the empty space at the bottom of my pop-up here. So I'm going to click on my pop-up. I'll open up my layout tab. And because we have this option selected to fit the height of this pop-up to all of the content inside of it, I can now set the minimum height to be 0, and it will collapse nicely around that. And now before we build out the workflow to create a new chat within our database, one thing I'd just like to explain is how we can create a filter here on our repeating group, which is just going to allow someone to type in a user's name and then have this repeating group reflect the content that's added in there. So if someone wants to search for a particular user and start a chat with them, that will allow them to do this. And so what I'm going to do is select on my repeating group and open up my appearance tab. And now traditionally when it comes to creating a filter on a repeating group's data source, if you were performing a search through your database, you could add in a particular constraint. And a good example is over on my homepage. So I'm just going to close that pop-up for the time being. And if I was to open up this repeating group here, where I'm searching for a list of chats, you may remember that I had performed a search for all of the chats where one of the users in the chats contains at least the current user. So this little filter here is known as a constraint. And so traditionally with a constraint like this, you could say, I only want to display a chat where someone's name in that chat is the same value as this particular search field here. So you would add a constraint that does that. But one thing you might remember is that on my pop-up here, the data source for this particular repeating group is not performing a search in our database. We're simply just referencing the list of contacts, which is of course a list of users, that this person has added to their account. And so a way in which we can create a filter on this list is by selecting the More option. And I'm going to type in the word filtered. And you'll now see that we have the ability to add in constraints. And so this looks more like the data source I'd shown you for our previous repeating group. And so what I'm going to do is add a new constraint here. And essentially I want to only display the users where their name contains the text added within this search box here. And so in order to do that, I'm going to need to just type in the word advanced. And this, as the name would suggest, is a little bit more of an advanced feature within Bubble. But it's a very powerful feature as it allows you to filter through this predetermined list here. So I'm going to select the advanced option. And as I mentioned, I'm going to only want to display the users where their name contains the text that's added in our search field. So from our list of all of the users' contacts, I'm only going to want to display the users where their name contains the text stored within our search new chat. And if you remember, that is the name of our search field here. It's value. And then one thing I'd like to point out is that this search field is not always going to have a value in it. So we only want this filter to run whenever someone actually types into this field here. And so what you'll see all the way down in the bottom right hand corner is this little checkbox where you can choose to ignore an empty constraint. And so this essentially will just recognize that if this search field is in fact empty, it will be an empty constraint, which means I do not want this filter to apply until someone actually types a value into this search box. I'm also then just going to update the way I'm sorting these users. This is just a little personal preference I have. I just want to sort these users by their name alphabetically. So I'm going to select to sort them by their name and set the descending value to be no. And that just means it's going to filter these from A to Z. I'll then choose to close this because that's all we'll need to change for the data source of this repeating group here. And what I'd like to now do is build out the experience that's going to allow us to actually create a new chat within our database. So whenever someone selects on this person's username here, what I'm going to want to do is one of two things. I'm either going to want to create a chat if a chat between these two users does not exist, or I'm going to want to open an existing chat if a chat between these two users does already exist. So I'm going to click on this text here, and I'm going to choose to start a workflow whenever this is clicked. And now before I actually create this new chat within my database, I'd just like to add one little workflow step that's just going to ensure that both users are saved to each other's contacts list. So essentially, let's just say in a real world setting, you have logged into your account, you've added me as a new contact, and then I'm displayed within your contact list here, and you want to create a new message with me. When you click on my name, you'll obviously want to create a new chat with me. But we'll also just need to ensure that you have been added to my contact list as well. And so what we're going to do is choose to, first of all, head to our data events here, and we're going to make changes to a thing. And the thing we're going to want to change is going to be the current sales user. So that is the person who's being displayed within our repeating group here. And in this case, the thing I would like to change within their account is going to be their list of contacts. And I would like to add to it the current user. So that would be you who has already added me to your contact list. Now, one thing I'd also like to do is just create a condition on this workflow step, which only allows this to run if the current sales user does not already have this person added to their list of contacts. Because if they did already have that person in their contact list, this is just going to be a pointless workflow step. So I'm going to add a condition that only allows this step to run if the current sales user, so back in my example, if you were logged in as the current user, I would be the current sales user because you're adding me to a new chat. And I'm going to reference their list of contacts. And I'd only like this to run when that list of contacts doesn't already contain the current user. And that's all we'll need to add for this step. From here, I'd like to add another step, which is going to now officially create a new chat within our database. So I'm going to head to our data tab. And in this instance, I'm going to create a new thing because a chat between these two users does not already exist. So the thing I'm going to create is going to be a chat. And then when it comes to the fields I'll need to change, I'm just going to need to reference the list of chat users, which is going to be a list of users. I'd like to add to it, first of all, the current user. So that would be you who's logged in and wants to create a chat with me. I'm then also going to add to the list of chat users the current sales user. So that would be me who's displaying in your list of contacts. And then once a new chat has been created within our database, I'd like to send the person who's creating this through to our dedicated chat page, which is where we're going to display all of our messages within that chat. So we're going to add an additional step here. We're going to select from the navigation event and we'll choose the go to page action. And now at this point, our destination page does not yet exist. So we're going to need to create this from scratch. I'm going to call this the chat page. I'll choose to create that. And now before I select this chat page as my destination page, there's one thing I'm going to need to change on it. So because I'd like to send someone through to this chat page and display all of the messages that belong to that particular chat, I'm going to need to create a way to store some data on that page. So that way Bubble knows which messages I should display for which particular chat. So if I open up my page drop-down menu here, I'm going to select to open my chat page, which at this point in time should just be blank. I'm just going to open up my property editor though, and what you'll see is that similar to a group or a repeating group, you can actually store data on a page. And in this case, I'd like to store the data of a particular chat, which means that when I send someone through to this page, I can send the data of one particular chat, and then later on, I can display all of the messages that belong to that chat. So if I then jump back into my index page, open up my workflow editor, and open the workflow where we just created a new chat, Within step 3 of our workflow here, I'm going to send someone through to our chat page. But what you'll now see is that because we have a type of content stored on that page, Bubble will require us by default to send data through to that page. And because the data type on that page is a chat, Bubble will need us to send through the value of one chat in our database, which of course is the new chat we've just created. So for the data I'm going to send through, it's going to be the result of step 2 in our workflow, which is where we've just created a new chat here. And now that's everything we'll need to include within this workflow here. So at this point in time, if a user was to open up their list of contacts, they could select to create a new chat with a person, and that would create that in our database and then send them through to that chat page. But what happens, of course, if a user has an existing chat with someone within our database? I obviously won't want to create a new chat every single time they want to talk to them. In this case, I'd like to just send them through to our chat page and display a list of all of their existing messages that they've exchanged. And so what I'm going to do is create another workflow that's triggered whenever this text element is clicked. Only this time I'm going to add a condition onto that workflow that only allows that particular workflow to run when a chat does exist between these two users in our database. So I'm going to jump over to my workflow editor here. I'm going to right click on my workflow we've just built, and I'm going to make a copy of it. I'm then going to paste in another version of this particular workflow. And in this case, I'm just going to add a condition onto this workflow that, as I mentioned, is just going to identify if a chat between these two users already exists, in which case I'd then like to just send them directly through to their existing chat page. And so I'm going to add a condition, and I'm going to actually perform a search in my database and just recognize if there is a chat in our database where the users within that chat contains the current user, and then if the users within that chat also contains the current sales user, so that is the person that someone wants to create a chat with, and if there is in fact a chat between these two users. So if the count of this search is in fact greater than 0, I'm just going to type in the number 0 there, this would in fact recognize that a chat does exist between these two users, and then it's going to run a different workflow from our first version. And within this workflow, I'm just going to delete the first 2 steps because I won't need to create a chat. Instead, I'm just going to want to automatically send this person through to this particular chat page. And what you'll now see is because that we don't have a new chat to reference, we're going to need to send through the data of the chat between these two users in a different way. And so I'm just going to right click on this and choose to clear this expression. And what I'm essentially going to do is I'm going to need to identify the only chat in our database that belongs to these two users. So once again, I'm going to perform a search in my database for all of the chats where the users contains the current user, and then also where the users contains the current sales user. And then what I'd like to do is send through the value of the first item in our database based on this search query here. And because there will in fact only be one chat between these two users, that means that it is the first and only item. And now one thing I should also just point out is that we've created a condition on this workflow trigger that recognizes if a chat between these two users does in fact exist. What we're also going to need to do is create a condition on our first workflow, which just recognizes if a chat between these two users does not exist, because in that case, I'd like to create that new chat. And so on our overall workflow trigger, I'm going to create a condition, and I'm going to once again perform a search in our database for all of the chats where, as you probably guessed, the users contains the current user, and where the users also contains the current sales user. And in this case, I'd just like to recognize if the count of that search is in fact 0, meaning there is no chat between these two users. I would like this workflow to now run, and it would create that chat between those two users. And now because both of these workflows are related to my feature of creating a chat, I'm going to also update their event color to be purple, just so that way whenever I visit my workflow tab, I know that these are the workflows that relate to creating or displaying an existing chat. And then from here, the very last thing I just want to build out within this particular step of our tutorial today is jumping back into my design tab. I just like to create a workflow that runs whenever someone actually wants to open an existing chat here between someone in their list of chats. And so because we've created our chat page, I can now send someone through to that chat page whenever they click on the message within a particular chat. And so I'm going to select on our red group here, which houses all of these elements. So this is our group chat. And I'm going to choose to start a workflow whenever this is clicked. And in this case, I just like to select from a navigation event, and I'd like to select the go to page action, because of course I'd like to send someone through to our dedicated chat page. So for the destination, this is going to be our chat page. And for the data I'll need to send, I'm just going to reference this group, it's chat, because of course we're storing the value of a chat within this group. It's as simple as that. And what I also might do is just update the event color here to be purple, because that does in fact relate to sending someone through to an existing chat. But that's everything I want to cover at this particular point in our tutorial. So from here, we now know how we can actually create a brand new chat, which of course, once it has been created, it's going to display within our repeating group list here. What I'd love to do now is just show you a quick preview of how this is all going to function, because it's been quite a while since we've actually seen an update of what we've built so far. Over in a preview of my homepage here, I'm going to open up my little pencil icon, which of course is going to display a pop-up with a list of all of my contacts. And now I've just jumped ahead and I've created a couple of different accounts here. But let's say I wanted to filter my contacts and only search for Simone. You'll see that I have the ability to type in her name, and then our repeating group will automatically filter my list of results here. And now if I was to click on Simone's account here, what you'll see is that because we don't have an existing chat between us in my database, this workflow will run and it's going to create a new chat and then send us through to my dedicated chat page, which if I was to just show you my URL here, what you'll see is that it's also sent through the unique ID of our chat between us in our database. And then if I was to jump back to my homepage, what you'll now see is that Simone is being displayed within my list of overall chats here, so I can see all of her details. Back in my Notion checklist, I'm going to tick off that we've finished building out the experience to create a new chat within our application. And to be honest, there wasn't a whole lot involved within this process. There were just lots of little complex nuances when it came to adding those conditions onto our workflow. But of course, it wasn't anything we couldn't manage using Bubble. At this point in our video, this is all I have time to include within the tutorial. As you can see, we've been building for hours and there's still so many features that I want to cover within more detail. At this point, we're still yet to build out the feature to actually send and display messages, which of course is going to include being able to send text and image-based messages. And then on top of that, we still need to learn how to create a group chat experience to allow multiple users to be able to communicate within our application. And look, if you wanted to get access to the full course, I'd recommend hitting the link in the description, so that way you can purchase it from my website. And while this course is going to cost you money, it's going to save you months of time having to learn how to rebuild those features from scratch. So I definitely do think it's worth your time checking it out. In the meantime though, I just wanted to say a massive thank you for watching up to this point in my tutorial. If you wanted to stay up to date with all of the Bubble resources I share, I'd recommend hitting that subscribe button, so that way you can be the first to know when I drop a new video. That's all from me though, and I wish you all of the best on your own no-code journey.